This is May 22nd, 2011.
It's okay, it's just, I didn't even lose anybody.
Just tornado devastation as far as the eye can see, and off in the distance there, beyond the firefighters there, they're doing search and rescue.
It's the first time I broke down because I knew my kids didn't know where I was.
We were flying through the entire tornado in our bathtub.
Sunday afternoon in Joplin. Church parking lots emptying, families driving home, high school graduation decorations, shoppers moving through big box stores, kids on bicycles, flags moving in warm wind. May 22nd, 2011. Joplin, Missouri. It was a Sunday in late May, the kind of Midwestern afternoon that felt ordinary enough to ignore. Church services had just ended. Families were heading home along Rangeline Road. Restaurants were filling for the dinner rush. Graduation season had arrived, and in neighborhoods across the city, people were thinking about parties, summer plans, and the final days of school. But nothing about the city suggested that it was about to become the site of the deadliest tornado in modern American history. Earlier that day, the Storm Prediction Center had outlined much of the region for severe weather. The wording was serious. Meteorologists understood the ingredients were there. Most residents did not. To them, it was another storm day in tornado country. Unsettling, but familiar. They had heard sirens before. They had sheltered before. Within minutes, that familiarity would become fatal. By the end of the evening, 161 people would be dead. More than 1,000 would be injured. A large section of Joplin would be torn apart. To understand Joplin, you have to understand 2011. It was one of the most violent tornado years the United States had ever seen. Weeks before Joplin, meteorologists had already been tracking repeated outbreaks across the South and Midwest. April had been catastrophic. Entire communities had been leveled. Forecast offices were exhausted. Emergency managers were already operating in a season that felt abnormal, even by plain standards. May brought no relief. Warm, moisture-rich air continued streaming north from the Gulf of Mexico. Above it, stronger winds swept east across the plains. That combination mattered. Warm air near the ground fuels thunderstorms. Powerful winds aloft tilt and organize them. Add instability, lift, and directional shear, and ordinary thunderstorms can evolve into rotating supercells, the type most capable of producing violent, long-track tornadoes. On May 22nd, those ingredients aligned again, not everywhere. By afternoon, storms were beginning to fire across parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. To most people in Joplin, the concern was background noise. The city had seen tornado warnings before. Residents knew the rituals.
So it's behind this wall of rain.
Yes, 150 miles an hour shear on the west side of Chicago.
See if it passes. That habit, the routine familiarity of severe weather, would shape what happened next.
We don't have all the roads. There's tornadoes, some maxi wedge on the ground. Man, this is a Joplin Trusting Storm Chaser.
Because Joplin was not a town that failed to hear warnings. It was a town that had heard too many of them. Late afternoon, storms west of the city began strengthening. Radar signatures tightened. Meteorologists watching live data saw the rotation becoming more organized. Broadcast coverage grew more urgent.
But look at the structure. Take a closer look at this thing. This is a very dangerous storm.
Tornado sirens once again.
Tornado sirens once again going off in Joplin. Those are definitely power flashes that we are seeing.
Some residents glanced at the sky and saw what looked like another severe storm moving in from the west. Dark. At 4:17 p.m., a tornado warning was issued for parts of the area. Sirens sounded. Some people responded immediately. Others did not. In tornado-prone regions, warning fatigue is real. Repeated alerts that do not lead to visible destruction can condition people to wait for confirmation. In Joplin, that hesitation mattered. The storm approaching the city was no longer just a severe thunderstorm. It was becoming a powerful, rotating supercell with the structural characteristics forecasters fear most. The radar presentation intensified. Debris signatures would soon confirm what the atmosphere was already preparing to do. Then came the escalation. The National Weather Service issued a tornado emergency. That phrase was reserved for the worst-case scenario, a large, violent tornado, confirmed moving into a populated area. For meteorologists, it was unmistakable language. For many residents, it was just another warning with stronger words. By early evening, the environment over southwest Missouri had become primed for violent tornado production. Surface temperatures were warm. Moisture levels were unusually high. Instability had built through the day. Winds changed speed and direction with height, allowing the storm to rotate more efficiently and sustain itself longer. This was no longer a storm that might produce a tornado. It was a storm already organizing around one. 5:34 p.m. Southwest of Joplin. A tornado touched down near the edge of the metropolitan area. At first, it was smaller and less defined than what it would become, but it intensified quickly. That is one of the most terrifying things about violent tornadoes. The transition can happen in minutes. The circulation widened, the condensation funnel thickened, the debris cloud at ground level grew. By the time many residents understood what they were seeing, the tornado was already becoming a wedge, broad, dark, and powerful enough to fill a large portion of the western horizon. It was moving directly toward the city. 5:41 p.m. Joplin, Missouri. Population just over 50,000. The warning had given parts of the city roughly 20 minutes. When the tornado entered Joplin from the southwest, it was already violent. It would eventually be rated EF5, the highest classification on the enhanced Fujita scale, with estimated winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. At points, it grew close to a mile wide. It moved through densely developed parts of the city with the kind of force that does not simply damage structures, it unbuilds them. The first major impacts came fast. Homes and apartment buildings began to fail in sequence. Roofs lifted, exterior walls collapsed, garages folded inward. In stronger structures, windows imploded first, pressurizing interiors before larger sections gave way. In weaker ones, whole rooms disappeared almost instantly. Then, the tornado entered the commercial corridor. This was one of the worst possible places for a violent tornado to hit. A heavily trafficked strip lined with stores, restaurants, parking lots, and major roads. At Walmart, shoppers and employees scrambled for cover as the building came under direct assault. The roof structure began failing. Walls collapsed, steel twisted, concrete, glass, signage, shelving, and vehicles were thrown together into one debris field. People who had seconds to react tried to shelter in bathrooms or interior spaces that had never been designed to withstand EF5 winds. Outside, the parking lot became a killing ground. Cars were lifted, rolled, crushed, and hurled into one another. Some were thrown into buildings. Others disappeared into debris clouds so dense survivors later described the air as solid with dust, insulation, and shards of glass. Nearby businesses suffered the same fate. Then the tornado struck St. John's Regional Medical Center. This was not a small clinic or neighborhood facility. It was one of the city's primary hospitals, a 7-story regional medical center serving the surrounding area. When the tornado hit, patients were inside. Staff were inside, suddenly exposed to extreme wind and flying debris. Windows blew out across multiple floors. Sections of the exterior were ripped away. Upper stories were so badly damaged that the building was later condemned and demolished. Patients in rooms that had existed 1 second found themselves staring into open air the next. Nurses shielded the vulnerable as glass and debris tore through hallways. Hospital staff moved patients under impossible conditions. The image of St. John's after the tornado became one of the defining images of the disaster. A hospital still standing, but gutted. From there, the tornado continued through residential neighborhoods. This was where the destruction became intimate. Commercial damage can be measured in inventory, square footage, and insurance loss. In parts of Joplin, entire neighborhoods were flattened. Homes were swept from foundations. In some places, there was so little left standing that survivors could no longer orient themselves. Streets looked wrong. Landmarks were gone. And inside that destruction were thousands of individual experiences. A child pulled beneath debris and found alive hours later. A parent calling a name into darkness and hearing nothing back. That is part of what made Joplin so devastating. It was not a tornado that carved through open country before reaching a few isolated homes. It moved through the core of a functioning city at one of the busiest times of the week. When it left the western side of Joplin behind and continued east, it had already changed the city permanently. The tornado remained on the ground for roughly 38 minutes and carved a path of destruction nearly 22 miles long, but statistics alone flatten what that means. For the people inside its path, those 38 minutes did not feel like a half hour. They felt like an ending. When the roar finally moved on, the first sound many survivors remember was not shouting, not sirens, an unnatural silence broken only in fragments. Car alarms, distant cries, collapsing debris, the hiss of ruptured gas lines, the crackle of downed power lines. Then came movement, neighbors crawling out of rubble, people climbing through splintered walls, strangers pulling concrete blocks with bare hands, drivers abandoning mangled cars and searching the wreckage on foot. The city's infrastructure had been hit as hard as its homes. In many places, first response began before first responders arrived. It began with survivors. As evening deepened, hospitals across the region began receiving the injured. The scale was immediate: crush injuries, head trauma, deep lacerations, to impalement, broken limbs, blunt force injuries from walls, vehicles, beams, appliances, glass. Medical personnel had to triage fast, often with incomplete information and in facilities already straining under the volume. Meanwhile, the death toll began to climb. At first, no one knew how high it would go. Fatalities were being discovered in homes, in vehicles, in businesses, in parking lots, in collapsed structures across the path. Family members searched hospitals, then shelters, then handwritten missing person lists, then the rubble itself. This is the part of a disaster that statistics cannot carry on their own. By the time the accounting stabilized, 161 people were dead. More than 1,000 were injured. It was the deadliest single tornado in the United States since modern record-keeping began using the current framework of historical comparison, and Joplin was still in the first hours of understanding what had happened. Night fell over a city that no longer functioned normally. Large sections of Joplin sat in darkness. Search and rescue teams moved through debris fields with flashlights, heavy equipment, and listening pauses. That last part mattered. Teams would stop machinery and stand still, trying to hear voices beneath wreckage. Sometimes they heard tapping, sometimes shouting, sometimes nothing. Shelters filled with displaced residents. Hospitals remained overloaded. Emergency operations expanded. Mutual aid flowed in from surrounding communities. And everywhere, people were asking versions of the same question. Have you seen them? In disasters like this, at night time changes the psychology of survival. Daylight shows you loss. Darkness magnifies uncertainty. You cannot see the full extent of what has been destroyed, only what your flashlight finds in front of you. For many in Joplin, that first night stretched endlessly. When the sun rose, the national understanding of Joplin changed. Aerial footage began circulating almost immediately. From above, the damage path looked less like scattered storm damage and more like a wound. A broad, brown scar cut across the city. Entire neighborhoods appeared absent. Commercial districts looked scraped apart. Debris covered roads, lots, medians, rooftops, and open fields. The city was still there, but it did not look like itself anymore. Federal disaster declarations followed. FEMA mobilized. State and local emergency management shifted from immediate rescue toward sustained response. National Guard support and outside resources expanded. News crews arrived. So did volunteers, relief organizations, and supply convoys. What they encountered was not a temporary disruption. It was urban devastation on a scale many Americans had never seen from a tornado. Property damage would eventually be estimated at roughly $2.8 billion, making it one of the costliest tornadoes in U.S. history. But even that number understates the reality, because economic loss captures buildings and infrastructure more cleanly than it captures displacement, grief, disability. Recovery in Joplin began immediately, but it did not move in a straight line. First came rescue, identification, temporary sheltering, insurance, demolition, rebuilding. Each stage brought its own problems. Debris removal alone was a massive undertaking. Millions of cubic yards of wreckage had to be collected, sorted, hauled, and processed. Utility restoration and reconstruction. Hazardous materials had to be identified. Unstable structures had to be secured or demolished. Personal property had to be separated. When possible, families displaced by the tornado moved into hotels, relatives' homes, rental units, temporary housing, and wherever else they could find room. Insurance claims surged. Contractors flooded the area. Some rebuilding happened quickly. Some dragged on for months or years. Some residents never came back at all. St. John's Regional Medical Center did not reopen as it had existed before. The damage was too severe. Its loss alone illustrated how disasters like Joplin are not just housing events. They are systems, events, and yet the city did rebuild. That part matters too. Not because rebuilding cancels loss. It doesn't, but because survival after a disaster is not only measured by who lived through the wind. It is measured by what a community can still organize, restore, and imagine afterward. The physical destruction in Joplin was obvious. The psychological destruction was not. Trauma after tornadoes does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it arrives as nightmares, sometimes as hypervigilance, sometimes as children freezing when thunder starts. After Joplin, mental health professionals documented the same patterns seen after other major disasters, and a persistent sense that ordinary bad weather might become catastrophic without warning. For children, the effects could be especially pronounced. Severe weather is difficult enough to process when a home survives. It becomes something else entirely when a child has watched walls come apart or has been trapped beneath rubble while hearing people nearby calling for help. Adults carried different burdens. This is why balanced documentary storytelling cannot stop at impact footage. The tornado itself lasted less than an hour. The afterlife of the tornado did not. Joplin forced difficult questions about warning systems, public response, building performance, and shelter access. One of the most discussed issues after the disaster was the warning process itself. On paper, residents had warning time. In practice, many delayed action. Investigations and post-event analysis found that previous false alarms, uncertainty about where to shelter, Confusion over changing warning language and the desire for visual confirmation all played a role. That made Joplin important far beyond Missouri. It became a case study. Meteorologists, emergency managers, and public officials studied how people receive warnings, how they interpret risk, and what language actually motivates immediate action. The phrase tornado emergency gained broader public weight after Joplin because the consequences of not understanding it had become unmistakable. Building resilience also became part of the conversation. Not all were implemented evenly, but Joplin altered the discussion. It reminded the country that forecast skill alone is not enough. A warning only saves lives if people trust it, understand it, and have somewhere meaningfully safe to go. Cities remember disasters in stages, first through wreckage, then through anniversaries, then through monuments, then through habits. Joplin remembers in all of those ways. Memorials were built, names were preserved. Ceremonies marked the date each year. Survivors gathered not only to mourn the dead, but to recognize one another. People joined by one evening that divided life into before and after. Remembrance also survives in less formal ways. In the route someone takes home when the sky darkens. In the basement stocked every spring. In the reflex to check forecasts twice. In the silence that settles over a room when tornado sirens begin. A city does not need a monument to remember. Sometimes memory is simply the way people learn to live afterward. Years after the tornado, Joplin looked rebuilt. New homes stood where destroyed ones had been. Businesses reopened, schools moved forward, traffic returned. The city functioned again, but a landscape restored in appearance, but changed in memory. That is one of the most enduring truths of disasters like Joplin. The physical environment can recover faster than the emotional map people carry inside them. May 22, 2011. One tornado, roughly 38 minutes on the ground. A path nearly 22 miles long, winds strong enough to earn an EF5 rating, 161 dead, more than 1,000 injured, billions in damage. Those numbers explain why Joplin matters historically. They do not explain why it still matters emotionally. They do not tell you what it meant for a city to lose homes, stores, schools, routines, confidence, and lives in less than an hour. There are places in Joplin now where new construction stands clean and solid under an ordinary sky. If you drive through them without knowing the history, you might see only another American city rebuilt after hardship. For the city, the rebuilding began soon after. For many of the people who survived it, the reckoning never fully did.